Hi, I'm Professor Andrew Stephen, the L'Oreal Professor of Marketing and the Associate Dean of Research here at the Side Business School at the University of Oxford. This is the second in our series of summary videos based on our Leadership in Extraordinary Times broadcasts, which were running between April and July of this year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In these broadcasts, we've heard from business leaders, we've heard from policy experts, and of course we've heard from academics and our faculty at the Side Business School talking about both the immediate and future implications of the pandemic on business, the economy, and society more broadly. In this summary video, we're going to have a look at the concept of building back better, which is a concept that's come up thematically across pretty much every broadcast we did, and there's been over 20 hours of broadcasts in that time. But what does it actually mean? How do we do that? What are some of the principles we need to keep in mind as we think about a better future coming out of this pandemic? So to start with, let's hear from my colleague, Dr. Peter Drobak, who's the director of the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship and a public health expert, who talked about how if we can get this right, get this rebuilding right, we can really position ourselves to deal with other global challenges that come to us.
What we do in the next months and perhaps year is really going to define this generation. Is it going to pull us further apart, or are we going to find ways to come together in ways that we haven't at a global level in a very long time? If we get this right, we'll be so much better positioned to confront the climate crisis and most of the other grand challenges we face in the 21st century. And so I think there's a roadmap for how we can work better together, and also how we need to rethink some of our systems, our economic systems, our social systems, in ways that are going to allow us to thrive more in an interdependent world in the 21st century.
Next, let's hear from Professor Alan Morrison, whose research covers subjects including governance and ethics, who is perhaps more cautious but also optimistic about the type of change that we could be seeing and how businesses might be thinking about their social responsibilities.
A crisis like this, we already have observed, hits the poorest hardest. They live in some countries in relatively cramped conditions on top of each other, so that a virus spreads rapidly. And in every country, the poorest are very often the people who can't work from home, who are obliged to go and face other people. In terms of what this means for the future of capitalism, it's interesting and tragic that this has happened in the wake of statements by organizations like the Business Roundtable saying that businesses should account for more than just the interests of shareholders. They should worry about their employees and about the communities they operate in. And that seems to be something that's got some traction at the moment, in that people are worrying about executive pay at a time like this. They're worrying about the distribution of resources. They're worrying about the distribution of the pain, the economic pain that comes with the health crisis. Whether this will have any sort of long-term effect on the way that we run capitalist economies, I don't know, but I suspect it will result in more debate and discussion, and that can only be a good thing.
Both Peter and Alan were talking about change at really a very macro level. Quite frankly, they're talking about system-wide changes. Changes, in fact, perhaps to the way capitalism itself operates. So let's dive into that a little bit more. And a real expert on our faculty into looking at large-scale change in organizations and systems is Dr. Eleanor Murray. So Eleanor spoke about this, but also had some important observations on resilience and the impact of the crisis on healthcare.
When we talk about resilience, we tend to think a lot about resilience being at an individual level. How do we maintain our own resilience to potential problems and crises? But there's definitely something to think about in terms of resilience, both at an organisational level and to create resilience in a system. What this crisis has shown is that it's important to think about how we think about resilience in a systems perspective, because as we've seen, if you have countries acting in their own interest, whether that's through the way they manage protective equipment or medical equipment, and don't take a sufficiently collaborative approach, then that has a real impact on other countries, in the whole way the global economic system works. So it's really important, I think, to think about how organizations, how corporations, governments going forward act in a more collaborative way, build alliances, and think about how they're going to act in relation to these broader issues like climate change.
So, thinking in terms of systems and collaborating across traditional boundaries, breaking down silos and so on. These are important when it comes to reshaping business and society. But I think another key idea that's emerged from some of our conversations throughout this series is something that at Oxford Said we've been talking about really for many years, and it's removing the emphasis on shareholder returns and short-term thinking, to think about a broader, multi-stakeholder and longer-term perspective of what business performance really means. So now let's hear from Jacqueline Novogratz, the founder of a non-profit global venture capital fund, on this topic.
The problem with this short-term thinking, and I think the whole business community is coming around to that, is that we're making decisions that are bad for all of us, certainly in the long term. Even if they're good for shareholders in the short term, I think increasingly we're finding that for shareholders over the long term, this short-termism is actually killing us. These two forces of capitalism and technology did release incredible energy and innovation in the world, did lift people out of poverty. We somehow raised these two forces to the ranks of religion. And now I think we're looking around and seeing the dark side, which every force has, which is our individualism, our divisiveness, our inequality, climate change. And so we have to move to this place where we actually are changing the new system, which puts our humanity and the earth at the center and not just profit.
And I think related to what we just heard, Trudy Lang, another faculty member at the school, whose research focused on frameworks and processes for strategy formulation and thinking about scenarios, observed that concentrating on profit often goes hand in hand with beating down costs.
It seems like the power then shifted to the consumer and to minimizing prices as much as possible. And then it became possible to deregulate even across borders. So supply chains spread out to the cheapest place for labor. And it seems that we've developed a system now whereby it's highly efficient, but it's really about reducing the cost of everything. And that means that there's not a lot of buffer in the system for these sorts of situations that we're seeing now. So I think if there is to be a shift, it's because we have this bigger shift about what it is actually that we value. Is it really the lowest possible cost, for example, or do we see a shift around actually, no, we need to build in more buffers into the climate change is very real. That to me, I think will be the key thing of whether we do this bigger mental shift, because then everything kind of lines up underneath that.
So really, again, what we're talking about is changing a system, which is a sort of a mental shift by everyone who's involved at any point in the supply chain, including the end customer. But it's not just a mental shift, it's about action, it's about changing things for real. And business has a major role, of course, but businesses alone can't change the system. So with that in mind, it was quite inspiring, I thought, to hear from Hiro Mizuno, who was formerly the Chief Investment Officer of Japan's Government Pension Investment Fund, because he talked about making the decision as a shareholder not to facilitate things like short selling.
We keep asking the corporate to do things, and we keep asking the corporate to deal with the long-term issues, and also the pay attention to the social, the impacts and etc. But I never saw asset owner actually saying we assume these responsibilities. Asset owners stepping up saying, we are owner, we are responsible, and we are mutually responsible. So when we say stewardship, usually people use the stewardship meaning we are steward of our pensioners, but also we are steward of the portfolio companies. We basically talk about the long-termism, but in reality, we're not practicing it. So, we suspended the stock lending, and it is a huge debate. It's very controversial internally and externally, because GPF gave up more than $100 million easy money by suspending stock lending. But we thought, if we are long-term investor, long-term owners, actually lending our stock while acting as an owner and making the money, and that the short, seller putting a, very strong, a short-term pressure on the corporate executive. Are we doing the right thing? We are saying we are going to walk the talk. We are going to walk the talk of the long-term investment.
All right, so we've heard from a lot of experts and perhaps lofty ideas, but what does this mean for you as an individual business leader? Because I think these are important principles, but let's kind of bring it down to earth. So in these sorts of videos, I'd now normally be putting up some action points and practical recommendations. But actually, you know what to do. The question is really more about how. Because I think it's pretty clear, if you buy into the arguments we've heard, what needs to be done. The question is, how do you put that into action? And that, according to our speakers, came down to really quite very individual things, such as character, values, courage, and organizational culture. Let's go back to hear about this from Eleanor Murray.
Firstly, I think it's important for leaders to remain curious and not shut down their thinking too soon, really remain open to emerging conditions. Secondly, they need to really utilize their networks and not just work within their organization, but beyond the organization, utilizing their networks to build coalitions. And engage not just with their employees, but also with their broader stakeholders. We might include investors and customers and the wider public. So really keep all lines of communication open and explain as best as they can where they're going, even though times are uncertain. And I think third, they need to take really decisive action based on the best evidence available, and also coping with the sort of apparently too inconsistent sort of approaches. So sort of a paradox situation, coping with paradox and being able to balance seemingly inconsistent or contradictory factors at the same time, because in this sort of complexity that we're seeing, you often need to somehow make sense of two very contradictory issues.
And I think related to that, let's hear from Jacqueline talk about the importance of moral leadership.
Our heroes in other periods of our history have been people who changed the world. And somehow over the last few decades, our heroes have become defined by money, power, and fame. And so it should be no surprise to us that our best students are being channeled toward in those tracks where they know they will be held in the highest acclaim by money, power, or celebrity. And how you shift that, again, starts with the decision inside, which is a character decision. Because in the short term, until enough of us move there, you're going against the grain. And I think that our definition of success to create a world in which we all can prosper must be one that we focus on not how much money we make for ourselves, but how are we enabling other people to prosper? How are we enabling other people to contribute in the world? When I think about moral leadership and the importance of courage in moral leadership, some of my real heroes are working at middle management jobs in the corporate sector, because it is so hard often to go against the grain that even if they hear a true desire on the part of a CEO to move toward a stakeholder model, at the end of the day, they're still being judged in terms of their own career by their P&L, period. And so those that go against the grain do so often at a real personal price.
So that brings us to the end of this summary video, really thinking about the concept of building back better and resilience and system-wide change. We've heard from our own academics as well as some thought leaders and industry leaders who really have thought deeply about this topic. And as I said before, in terms of making the changes yourselves in your organizations, in your lives, it's not so much about the what to do. I think that's more obvious than not. It's the how do we do it. And so to kind of recap, I think there's a few key points as takeaways here. None of this is easy. It's of course easier said than done, but I think starting to get into the how is going to push us towards viable and hopefully meaningful and sustainable actions. So first up, systems thinking. We can't really make a change in a broader system on our own, which means we need to collaborate, which means we need to see the system as a whole, or the ecosystem, or the industry, or however you want to think about it. But your organization is a cog in a machine. So you need to think about your place in that system and try and sort of map that system. And then second, related to that, is then that's where you look for collaboration opportunities. And these may be across boundaries. You could think about collaboration across boundaries in your organization, but you could certainly think about it across boundaries of the firm, with all sorts of organizations and partners. And I think that collaborative spirit has been on the rise throughout the pandemic, and we want to really encapsulate that in how we think about moving forward. Another one is about taking a long-term perspective. We need to be making decisions now that will have some kind of payoff, for want of a better term, some kind of result, if you will, an impact sort of now, but that clearly have longer-term decision outcomes in mind. So we're sort of playing both, short-term and long-term, but I think that's just the way it's going to have to be. And that's what all of the leaders that we've been speaking to across this series have essentially been saying. So that decision-making for the long-term is going to be important. And then I think finally, the concepts of resilience are really, really key here. And so throughout the pandemic, we've probably been seeing in our organizations areas where we're really quite resilient, maybe surprisingly so, and then areas where we're less resilient. So it's brought to the surface some good and some bad, I suppose. We need to jump on that. We need to really double down on those really good resilient practices, identify kind of why they are so resilient. It could be business processes that just turn out to be more resilient, or teams and people, probably a big part of it. And then also identify those areas where things haven't been so good, not to point the finger, but so that it's diagnosed so that it can't happen again. Because as we build back better and we think about systems thinking, collaboration, longer term impacts, and multiple stakeholder perspectives as well, we also need to think about how do we build our own systems, our own little part of the broader system, so that it's tougher and more resilient for whatever challenges come our way next time.